Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we have what's one of our shortest days of the APUSH year, but it's an important one. We address here the subplot, what I've called the subplot of the first semester of APUSH, that of slavery, often referred to as the South's peculiar institution. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past comes the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again. We have two objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 16, describe how slavery shaped the social and economic relations in the Old South, and 17, explain how the South justified that practice of slaveholding. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 16. Here I want to talk about the Old South, and we're going to return to our story of King Cotton. Because, cotton was the most important industry of the South. Its production was basically what the entire Southern economy was built on. And slavery, the peculiar institution of the South, it was expected that it would die out on its own, but it didn't die out. It actually grew to 4 million slaves by 1861. And cotton had replaced sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor in the 19th century. The strength of American slavery rested on cotton. And the cotton industry, of cotton industry, 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from southern United States. And cotton supplied the textile mills in the North and in Europe. And as early as 1803, cotton represented America's most important export. By 1860, it was well over half of all of the total exports of the entire country. It was the crucial piece of the American economy. Subpoint B. Although the African slave trade was prohibited, you could no longer, import African slaves into the United States. That was a prohibited deal. The sale and trade from slaves within the United States flourished. More than 2 million slaves were sold at the country's borders between 1820 and 1860. And the main business districts of southern cities contained the offices of slave traders, and auctions took place at slave markets. So even though there's no longer an importation of slaves, slave sales within the country and homegrown slavery was a booming business. Subpoint C. 3/4 of white Southerners were not directly involved in the slave business. They didn't own slaves. So when we talk about slavery in the South, we're really talking about 1 in 4 Southerners were slave owners. And most people lived on self-sufficient farms that didn't require additional labor or slave labor. They were not integrated. The fact that these farms weren't integrated into the market economy, it was really the major reason why the South never developed much industry, this kind of like small farming model. In the Upper South, slave owners made up even a smaller percentage of the population than was present in the Lower South. States like Virginia and Maryland, those Chesapeake states in the Upper South, they had some industry. They even had a little bit of a diversified economy. They were by far the most diverse economies of all the southern states. In the Lower South, though, the economic growth pattern was entirely different. Take the city of New Orleans. New Orleans was the only real city of significant size in the South, and it was a gathering point for cotton or sugar as a port city. It was the world's leading exporter of slave-grown crops. So the city of New Orleans was profiting on the profiting on the business of slavery, even if they weren't directly slave owners. The results of the slave business came through their port. The region produced less than 10% of all of the manufactured goods in the entire country. And that's because slavery just made agriculture so profitable for people. The North itself wasn't immune to slavery, and it's easy to kind of separate our dichotomy of the Northerners are the good guys on race relations and the Southerners are the bad guys, but it's more complicated than that because the North itself wasn't immune to slavery. Northern merchants and manufacturers were also participating in the slave economy because they also shared in its profits. All that cotton was grown in the South but shipped to the North to be turned into textiles and clothing. Still, most white Southerners supported a planter elite and slavery, mostly because of regional loyalty and kinship ties. It wasn't necessarily economic ties. Remember, the Upper South, fewer than, in the South, 3 out of 4 people do not participate in slavery, and in the Upper South, it's even less than that. So when Southerners support slavery, it's not necessarily like they're supporting it for their own interests, although they might be in their own interests. It could be regional ties or kinship ties or just plain old racism. Roman numeral number 17. Here I want to talk about the explanation of it. So subpoint A, in 1850, the majority of slave-owning families owned 5 or fewer slaves. So, even though that slavery, not everybody in the South is a slave owner, the ones that are slave owners, most of them are not the huge like plantations of every slave. They're fewer than 5. Fewer than 2,000 families in the whole South owned more than 100 slaves. 100 slaves is kind of like the line between a significant slave owner and maybe a small-time slave owner. The ownership of slaves, though, once a person had a slave, it provided the route to wealth and status and influence. Men would watch the world market for the price of cotton. They were investing in infrastructure and carefully managing the details of their plantations. Plantation mistresses were caring for sick slaves. They would be the ones that oversee the domestic servants. So you have the slaves in the field hands, and then you have the domestic servants, ones working inside the house. And the women were supervising the plantation while the master was away. Planters actually ended up discouraging their sons from entering manufacturing. The wealthiest spent money on these elegant mansions, all of which were made possible by the slave economy. Subpoint B. The pro-slavery argument had several things that was like the basis of their arguments, including a commitment to white supremacy, that if you break up slavery, then white people are going to lose their status in the country. It also presumed, there was this presumed biblical sanction on slavery. This is a little bit complicated for us moderns to understand, but people at the time often interpreted, like people so often do, had interpreted pieces of religion to say that, like, well, God allows slavery here and uses, and the Israelites had slaves here, and so there's nothing inherently wrong about slavery, was the argument they're claiming. I don't think those arguments really hold up today, and they didn't hold up very well then. There was also a historical precedent that slavery just seemed in a lot of ways to be essential to human progress. Like, we have slaves, and then everybody, like the country has gotten so much better, and if you didn't have slaves, then maybe the country wouldn't have gotten better. There's like almost this slavery sense of determination that's wrapped up into it. Paternalism was ingrained into slave society, and it enabled slave owners to think of themselves as the good kind of slave owners. They were kind and responsible masters, even as they were buying and selling human property. Again, I don't think these arguments hold up today. This outlook, though, of like, but they're a good slave owner, that masked and justified the brutal reality of owning human beings. By 1830, Southerners defended slavery in terms of liberty and of freedom. Without slavery, they said freedom wasn't possible because it enabled all of the pieces of the American life. The pro-slavery arguments even began to argue against ideas in the Declaration of Independence, that equality and freedom were universal entitlements. Take, for instance, John C. Calhoun. He believed that the language in the Declaration of Independence was actually a dangerous language and that Americans shouldn't idealize it so much. Subpoint C. Between the years of 1800 and 1840, slavery was abolished in most of Spanish America and in the British Empire. Abolition in the Americas influenced debates over slavery in the United States. So as other countries are abandoning slavery, Americans are going and having this question pop up for them. Pro-slavery advocates use the post-emancipation decline in sugar and other cash crops as evidence against Britain's abolitionism failure. Essentially, as those countries were beginning to, shed slavery and abolish slavery, it coincided, unfortunately, with a downturn in the market, and they're saying, oh yeah, see, now you're getting all these economic problems compounded together. Abolitionists, on the other hand, argued that former slaves' living conditions, their rising standards of living, showed that emancipation had succeeded, because the question is not about economy, the question is about human beings. By mid-century, the New World slavery remained only in a handful of countries: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. This sub-pot of slavery is about to blow up. We got a few more details, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.